how do you strike the balance between helping people and giving people better tools, but also making things accessible enough for even the people who have the fewest amount of choices?
I think the biggest thing is being extremely aware of financial privilege.
Yeah.
And I think that, you hear these stories of doctor pays off $300,000 of debt in 2 years. Lawyer pays off over $200,000 of debt in 4 years. Well, then that means you need to do that too.
Right.
And I think that that's a really, that's not the right messaging. I think that, and that's why I try to be, without disclosing my salary like to the penny, I try to be very transparent in that I do earn a 6-figure income salary. I have since I was 26, since I graduated law school. I have this pretty large financial privilege that allowed me to pay off that kind of debt in that amount of time. So when I talk to my clients, I'd say 95% of my clients do not earn 6-figure incomes. Easily, 95%. Most of my clients, a typical client of mine earns something around maybe like, $50,000 to $70,000 living in here in New York City, which that alone is pretty good for a single person, just in America generally. In New York City, of course, people will argue what's a...
Well, I think for cost of living, that's probably equivalent to like $28,000 or $30,000 in a different area.
Yeah. States like Florida or Oklahoma,
right.
Lower cost of living states. So I have to constantly check myself and my financial privilege when I'm approaching a client that earns, a third or a fourth of the income that I make. And I think that acknowledging that, owning up to it, and then keeping in mind that the principles that I used is what I want to teach others. Mm-hmm. The overall lessons, the overall, budget what you earn, start investing small. When I started investing $50 a paycheck. Maybe it's not $50 a paycheck for you. Maybe it's $10 a paycheck for you. But you start small, you start somewhere. Those are the general principles that I use with my clients, and I've used with all of my clients, from my recent college grad client that, graduated with a $35,000 a year income to my doctor client who earns something like $190,000, right? So I need to strike that balance. And I think that I can't say enough how important it is to acknowledge the financial privilege that I do have. And I think because I grew up in a low-income community, I am even more aware of it. Mm. Chelsea, I go back home. My community is not a community where a 6-figure income is the norm.
Right.
My father never made anywhere near the kind of income that I make or that my sisters make. And so I think that we need to be extremely mindful of that. And I think because of the community that I grew up in and how I was raised, I am really sensitive to that. I guess my biggest criticism is there are a lot of creators in the personal finance space that think that that's the norm, and so they want to paint the picture as, well, if she did this in 4 years, well, then you can also do it in 4 years. Like, right. You also need to do it tomorrow. Right. And if you don't, then that's your fault. And I'm here to say, no, for you, it might take 8, 10, 12 years, right? It's going to depend on everyone. But I hope that what I can teach my clients is that, again, general principles of making a plan, creating a budget, intentional spending. Those are, I think, the things that I try to really, teach my clients and how I try to strike the balance.
I think that's really important. It's very interesting because the story that you have personally would be, I think, in a lot of ways, like the really, I don't know how to say, like, not tone deaf, well, also tone deaf, but kind of unaware money media, that's like, you can do it too. Everyone just needs to make all the right choices and you'll be a millionaire. in many ways, like your story would be the kind of example that they hold up, right? I mean, your parents came here, and they probably do. They do. But your parents came here as immigrants from Central America. They, worked probably very, very low-paying jobs, slowly built savings over the course of decades. And now they have 3 daughters, it sounds like, who all have good-paying jobs, at least one of whom's an attorney, who achieved all these, incredible financial milestones. So a lot of people would point to that and say, well, anyone could do that then. Yeah. And I hate that in a lot of ways, because I feel like it turns what should be, it turns an exceptional situation into a standard by which everyone should be held. And I think, when you look at the structural barriers that exist for a lot of people, I don't know, I assume from what your story that you were born here. So you grew up speaking English, yes. Going to school, and that was never a barrier for you. I mean, even in your story, there are probably many areas that you can point to and say, these were areas in which I had, some kind of a structural advantage. But it's interesting how your story in particular, I think, could be used as such an example. And I wonder, I often struggle personally with that same feeling of, to what extent do we think things like this are possible? Not necessarily a story as extraordinary as yours, but even just class mobility, because class mobility in America has decreased decade after decade, and now we're pretty far behind most developed countries. Generally speaking, where you're born, class-wise, is going to be about where you end up, and 60% of all wealth in this country is inherited in some form. So when I look at structural barriers like that, politically, where I fall is I'm very much in the area of it's a miracle if anyone does well. But then people see stories like yours, and they feel like, oh wow, this is really such a great example of exercising agency to get somewhere. So where do you fall, even just in your day-to-day thinking and ideology about what is and isn't possible, and what people should and shouldn't strive for?
So I'd like to point out that I think 50 things had to happen in my life, fall into place in order for me to get to where I am. I had enormous privilege growing up, even though my household income was probably around the federal poverty line. I grew up in a 2-parent household. I had siblings that were older than me and spoke English and could help me apply to colleges. I went to Catholic school. I didn't go to our neighborhood public schools. And in my neighborhood, that was a pretty big deal, because my parents were able-bodied and able to work side hustles so that they can pay for my tuition to go to Catholic school from kindergarten to 12th grade. So a million things had to go right in my life for me to wind up where I am today. And I try to be really mindful of that, and I try to maintain that balance of being mindful of it, but also sharing that with others, and not in a way that says, well, you too would have to have a million things go right in your life in order for you to wind up where I've wound up. And so I think that a big thing is, yes, I do believe that there are extraordinary stories out there of, children of immigrants, of children from low-income communities, of children from, crime-ridden neighborhoods that grow up and accomplish great things in tech and law and finance and all areas. But I think it's a very dangerous narrative to point to those, maybe 100 examples and think that that's what everyone should be expected to also accomplish. I don't think that narrative is right, especially when you look at, for example, where I grew up in New York City, in our public schools. My best friend went to a public school growing up, and my textbooks were up to date, hers weren't. We can't put those same, I don't want to say expectations, but maybe those standards just across, if we're not talking also about how race plays a huge role in all of this, and how redlining and redlining districts and just so many issues, we need to look so much deeper. And I think the conversation that's happening now in our country is exposing a lot of that. So that's why it's, sometimes, honestly, Chelsea, sometimes I do feel guilty, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes I do feel guilty when I see my story highlighted or, for example, I was highlighted on Good Morning America. And so it was like a really big deal. My family was tuning in. They like shared everything with the family. So and, it was like they were recording it with their iPhones, even though I told them I have a recording of the actual show. They were recording it with their iPhones.
That is a great boomer thing.
But I think that, I try to look at that and yes, I'm proud of that, right? And I'm proud of that accomplishment. But I also need to think about, there's someone else that could have accomplished the same thing maybe as I did, but maybe they didn't grow up in the same circumstances that I did.
Right.
And so I need to be mindful of that as well. And so, I do think, and I think a big part of the reason why I do share my story and why I do go to schools on career day, and when that 5th grader asks me, how much money I make, I actually there in that scenario, I do disclose it. Because I do think that there's so much power in seeing someone that either looks like you or has a life experience as you saying about something that they accomplished. For me, that person was Justice Sotomayor. She grew up in my same neighborhood. She went to my same I went to her same elementary school, her same high school. And so when she came to our high school my senior year, and I heard her story, and I heard what she had accomplished, being someone that lived in public housing, I didn't live in public housing. So boom, that's a privilege right there that I had, right? And that she didn't. But her being able to share that story, that to me showed me the potential of what could be possible. And so that's why I do share my story, because I do want kids from, these low-income communities or children of immigrants to say, wow, that could be accomplished. But I'm also very mindful of acknowledging the privilege that I do have. And also even, a couple of weeks ago, I talked a little bit about how higher income individuals are taxed and, et cetera, et cetera. And I put it out there, I think it was like on my Instagram story, that I'm very happy to pay my taxes.
Yeah, same.
I'm very, very happy to do that. To me, it's an honor. It is a privilege to be able to do that, to live in a city where a lot of social welfare programs are funded, and so I think that that's also, that's the balance, is, being willing to share your story while acknowledging all that you had to get there and what you do have now, but also the willingness to partake in a society that hopefully one day will help establish some type of level of equality, some type of level.